Okay, so to find these two models, I noted that the first of them, these two models that uh, incorporate some substantive considerations for health economics calculation, health economics assessments. The first of them is available in the participant models, specifically in the interaction of weight and diabetes Melbourne Health Economics. Off the main AnyLogic 8 example areas. You can download that. The other is slightly harder to find, but it's under the hybrid models area because this indeed is a hybrid models, and it's called Basic Health Economics, ABM, AnyLogic 7v2. Apologize for the mouthful. Served its purpose at one point. So if you download each of those, you'll be equipped to sort of follow along the coverage here. And the coverage is not going to involve building these models, but it will involve assessing their overall structure and understanding the ways in which that supports calculation of important quantities within health economics, cumulative life years lived, cumulative quality adjusted life years lived, incremental costs of various, accumulated costs of various types. And also, as we'll see, these models include calculations of incremental cost effectiveness ratios, where we're taking a look at the costs exerted per QALY saved, the extra costs required per QALY saved between an intervention and a baseline. Recognizing that it's possible the intervention will cost extra money, but by so doing, will save lives. In which case, that would be a positive ratio, a ratio with values above 0. It's also possible that it could cost something and cost lives, but in that case, we wouldn't do it. But it is possible that we would cost extra money and yet not save any lives, right? Further, it's possible that it will cost less money and save lives. That would be a win-win. Or it's possible.
Professor, we're just viewing your Google Drive
Yes.
right now. I'm
Yes,
not sure if that was intentional.
that is intentional. Yeah. Thanks. Alternatively, it could save money, but end up costing lives. So all 4 of those are possible, and we'll be seeing how those are enabled within the context of these calculations. So why don't we go and we'll open first the basic health economics model. Okay. So you've just downloaded it. You should be able to find it and open it. And despite its name, it should be readily accessible by this version of AnyLogic 8. There was a disjunction between sort of a discontinuity between older versions of AnyLogic and newer ones in terms of what they could read at some point within the past 2 years. So if you encounter any models that you're trying to open from our example models, which you cannot open, it says you need an earlier version of AnyLogic or what have you, let us know so that we could remedy that. I, in fact, did that with this model earlier over lunch. Okay, so let's go take a look at this model. I'm gonna close up things that are visible here just to not distract us. And I'm going to close this model that we had talked about in an earlier session. Okay, so I'd like to look at the basic health economics ABM. Now, understanding this model will be easier. The understanding could be more readily secured with respect to certain totals up of quantities once we talk tomorrow about additional types of modeling, in particular stock and flow modeling. I'm planning to cover that some tomorrow in the discussion of multiple modeling methods and hybrid modeling. But for now, I'll try to guide you through some of the key intuitions and understanding for this particular model. So hopefully that won't be too big a scale. Now, so this model, if we click on main, we'll see that there's a population of people within that model in a way that will be familiar. And there are some parameters here. I see one of them, but there are several others here which are visible if you kind of go and click through the interface here. But those parameters are parameterizing the model or allow scenarios to run it with different assumptions. And some of them involve interventions like this prediabetes prevention mechanism. And to allow for scenarios that are not only baseline scenarios, have default values for those parameters, but also interventions which posit a lower prediabetes, lower rate of developing prediabetes given some risk factors, but also exert costs for the intervention. We have some alternative scenarios. Now, within this model is a construct that you're broadly familiar with, namely a population. And that's a population of people. You'll notice there's a set of statistics computed from that, which include, importantly, certain health economic quantities, such as cumulative quality of life or new costs per year or count of non-diabetics, et cetera, and count of pre-diabetics. However, I'm going to, before dwelling on those, we're going to go in and look at the logic for each person in the population. And you'll see that this logic is exceptionally simple and one could say simplistic from a health standpoint. And there's many ways that from a domain standpoint, having spent a fair bit of time in my modeling life, modeling both diabetes and diabetic end-stage renal disease, there's many, critiques I could offer or ways that I might adjust the scope of this model for certain purposes. But the point is for this to be a scaffolding. It's called basic health economics to serve as this really small teaching model in this regard. So please don't be distracted too much by the rather stylized way in which it depicts occurrence of some of the factors. So what we have here in this single state chart in this case is a depiction of stages of risk associated with individuals in the population with respect to dysglycemia. So we have normal glycemic people up here on the top. Those are people whose blood sugars are in balance. We have pre-diabetic individuals. individuals who are at risk of developing diabetes but haven't done so. And that level of risk with which they're current associated doesn't put them at the sort of marked risk of developing side effects of diabetes, complications, sequelae of diabetes, like frank type 2 diabetes would. But it is a warning sign, and it's a sign that their body may be getting, given their diet and exercise levels, they may be less able right now. They're showing less ability to manage their blood sugars, and by spotting them early, we might be able to save money by putting them back in a normal glycemic state. I'm elaborating this in part because this lies at the basis of one of the interventions we'll be focusing on which we'll be focusing. So there's potential once they're pre-diabetic, by appropriate lifestyle interventions with diet or exercise, etc., sedentary behavior, to put them back in the normal glycemic state. However, given this risk, there's a high risk otherwise, absent effective change, for them to develop type 2 diabetes, which in this model is treated as being one-way trip. We know since that time through certain bariatric surgeries, there's the potential for reversing it, and there's discussion taking place on the side of pharmaceuticals such as Wegovy and Ozempic, about possible implications on diabetes. But with having developed type 2 diabetes, well, there are some basic costs that are often associated with managing diabetes, things like testing strips, the purchase of a blood glucometer to measure blood sugar levels using those testing strips, etc. The costs here are the cost for extra patient care. The costs here are rather limited. They're not the type of thing that's going to cause many individuals the most profound of economic transformations, but they are still significant. An individual who stays for a prolonged time with type 2 diabetes could go on to develop end-stage renal disease. And end-stage renal disease is an exceptionally dangerous health condition. It's a debilitating health condition. It requires regular dialysis, like 3 times a week, which will often totally upend a person's life. And end-stage renal disease poses grave risk, not only to the physical function and the health of the kidneys has already been grievously damaged, and it will often lead to kidney failure within a modest number of subsequent years, less than 5, for example, often. But it can also cause great damage to an individual's other health because of higher risk because of immune system damage done by this state. It can lead to them becoming very subject to a risk of infection, and they're at grave risk of infection, and that infection being very serious. So end-stage renal disease is a health condition that imposes huge health impacts, huge impacts on quality of life, but also very high costs. Something like, and here in Canada, I think it's on the order of about $50,000 a year or more, with the cost of the dialysis conferred, etc. An individual in that state can then go on, if they're deemed sufficiently healthy and have otherwise good prospects of living a fuller life, are can be a candidate for transplant. And other hybrid models we've built, you'll find in the pages of Nephron, for example, publishing on transplant related factors in much more detail than is afforded here. But people can go on and develop transplant, get a transplant. That cost, this is really important. I've been emphasizing costs attendant on being in some of these states. For diabetes, quite low per year you're in the state, but still significant. End-stage renal disease, very high per year, like 50,000. What's really notable about a transplant operation is the fact that you have a sudden marked imposition of costs for the operation itself and the associated logistics. It requires um, a living or a cadaveric, someone who's recently passed, a kidney donor matched, and delivery during the operation of that into the body, and great care being taken to minimize the risk of graft failure, and then delivery as well on subsequent use of immunosuppressant drugs to prevent the rejection of the graft, the rejection of the kidney that's been put in. But an individual in this state can be comparatively healthy for decades if they take care of their kidney, if they're engaged in appropriate lifestyle and management and so on, and avoid further damage caused by diabetes or what have you. This is diabetic end-stage renal disease being characterized here for type 2 diabetes particularly. And then an individual, if their transplant fails, they can go back to an end-stage renal disease state and resume dialysis. The cost per year of being on a transplant is with a transplant is modest compared to the cost of having end-stage renal disease, but the cost associated with the actual operation and the associated delivery of services and hospital stay and so on can be very large indeed, like $75,000, $75,000. Yes, this is thank you. I think the there should be per year. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I don't know what happened to the CSOL need to be changed per year. Thank you. So that's a key point of characterization. So let's go. I will change these and I'll push my version of the model out. Thanks to Mattias for finding that. Okay. Model time units. Wow. Okay. This is a model I imported from an earlier version of AnyLogic, and maybe the units got somehow screwed up. Right. Okay. Well, there we go. We'll push this out. Forgive me, but I just want to correct these things, and I want to correct it in terms of any outcome measures too. So we'll okay, just about done. That's already per year, and this is per year. And for Wade's comment, this should be per year, or it should be years. Thank you. Color for state. Okay, thank you, Wade. That's great. I love having my students go over this. That's awesome. Okay. And so that's color for state, I would expect to be in person. So Wade, where is it found? The color for state? Is it in Maine?
No, it's in the person. It looks almost as if you're dealing with a different version than we downloaded from Google Drive.
Oh,
Like if
really?
I may
Hmm. Hmm.
if I may share my screen for a moment, you can gaze upon the differences.
Are you sure you've opened basic health economics.
Yes.
Sure. Do you want to share your screen? Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed the same thing. The version you're looking at has is AnyLogic 7, and the one we downloaded has V2 as a suffix on it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's um
This version still has the issue with the time units, but it's also got this function color for state,
got it. I see.
which contains an error here.
Uh, I see. Okay.
So we don't need that person prefix as we are already in person.
Um, yes, although I'm not sure that it hurts actually. It
And that's the source of the error.
really? Okay, that's fine. Huh.
So like
Hmm.
the field person normal glycemic cannot be referenced to.
That's interesting. Okay.
And then
Hmm.
if I delete
Eliminate that.
person
Yeah.
and build again, it's fine.
Okay. That's curious. I don't know why that would be giving the scoping. I'm not sure that why that would be causing an error. Okay. That's good to know. I appreciate knowing about that. Yeah, given that I'd have to make those changes again. I think I'll keep this one as it is and do the display from this show with the reflection that the one that's on the site will be a kind of a likeness of this, but not exactly the same. Okay, so so I'm leading these things through, and what's notable is that as people go through this, all of them are subject to a certain mortality risk, and that mortality risk grows hugely higher as they progress down this. Um,
Share your
so,
screen again, please.
oh, thanks. Yeah. So their mortality risk is markedly escalates as they proceed down this continuum in terms of the severity of their diabetic related conditions. And so the basic constructs here should be familiar. The fact they're removed from the population, quite familiar. Um, and not surprisingly, in Maine, we can summarize uh, characteristics of those individuals. For example, within the population itself, uh, we could total up, the number of pre-diabetics or the count of non-diabetics. So sort of clumping together pre-diabetics with normal glycemic individuals, right? Pretty familiar stuff here. Um, but where I want to highlight the differences starting to emerge, or the extra layering um, of health economics on this model can be found at that person level. So I'll go there again. And you'll notice that this model is sort of simulated in a familiar way. What's notable, though, is some extra logic that is epiphenomenal. So it's not affecting the behavior of the how the model evolves over time. It's reporting related. It's related to the observation processes, the reporting from this model. And specifically, each of these states, the normal glycemic state, the pre-diabetic state, type 2 diabetic state, etc. Each of them in turn has a certain quality of life recorded. That's quality of life. And a certain cost per year whilst in that state, whilst a person spends time in the state. So for each year that someone spends in the normal glycemic state, for example, there are no extra dollars. There are no dollars considered expended. We'd have to fully articulate what so-called perspective we wish to adhere to: a societal perspective, a payer perspective, an out-of-pocket individual perspective. I'm glossing over that a little bit, but we'll count no extra costs as being borne by the system in this case, so more of a focus on the whole societal cost. No extra costs is being borne. In the pre-diabetic state, however, we'll treat there as being an extra cost associated, we'll say, with extra testing going on per year, maybe to get their blood work done and particularly measure HbA1c levels, glycated hemoglobin levels. They also have, while a normal glycemic person, I should have emphasized, is treated here as having a quality of life of 1, the quality of life of a pre-diabetic is treated as 0.95. So it has some impacts on quality of life as characterized through the model, perhaps associated with worry, etc., but perhaps associated with just not feeling well and being in a somewhat dysglycemic state, not feeling at one's full one would like to feel, but it's a fairly modest impact on their quality of life. For type 2 diabetics, the quality of life drops further, and the cost per year that they spend in the state is up to $2,000. So what that means is if there's an individual who's in that state for a year's time, $2,000 of cost will be imposed on the system. If they spend another year, another $2,000. So this is a state-based cost in the terminology of activity-based costing. In the end-stage renal disease state, the quality of life of an individual is treated as dropping yet further. Quality of life here might be health-related quality of life as he listed it through utility scales, for example. EQ5D might be a good example, but it's a quality of life of 0.65. So a really large-scale drop of 0.35 over the normal glycemic individual, and a vastly higher cost per year, $50,000 a year. In a transplant state, the costs are lower and the quality of life is higher. So, many individuals seek to be on the transplant waiting list in hopes of that getting a transplant would bring much life to their years, to their remaining years. The costs are also lower for being in that state. There are anti-suppressant drugs, etc., but it's comparatively low. What's really notable here, though, and what I really want to emphasize as further fleshing out the picture, is moving beyond state-based, activity-based costing costs to ones that are event-based. So here, when there's an occurrence of a transplant, and this should be called transplant, an individual, the costs accumulated rise. And as we'll soon see, we keep track of undiscounted costs without any discounting to reflect sort of opportunity costs for money. This is a common need within health economics models to record things both on a discounted and undiscounted basis. And basically $75,000 of costs is accrued, both when considered undiscounted, and for discounted we accrue that times a discount factor, which reflects the fact that this may be being accrued some period of time in the future, and that cost then might be treated as similar to a larger amount of cost borne now that could have been invested in some reliable instrument, perhaps traditionally, U.S. Treasuries, although not these days. Okay, so the idea here is that we have costs and quality of life being tracked across these health states. And those costs are accruing, some of them on a per year basis, adding up or being technically integrated up, but some being accrued on an event basis. When this transition occurs, $75,000 in cost is borne. And of course, an individual can pass away, in which case, from the purposes of this model, we characterizing them as leaving the model. It could be argued that there should be taken extra special end-of-life costs, but this is treated as not having particularly special end-of-life costs beyond those might be imposed for a normal glycemic individual. Okay, so this is the situation at an individual level, and this general model holds this general idea of having activity-based costing, states recording the quality of life associated with that state, and the cost borne in that state as considered from the appropriate perspective, health economic perspective that you've decided to take. Now, what's notable is that these costs are, associated with a single type of state here. And we will see in the other model, this is the sort of designed to be an extremely simple model. We'll see in another one how we might take into account multiple state charts. So where someone might have diabetes progression and might also have, costs associated with weight management, two common comorbid conditions, or associated with heart disease, or associated with respiratory dysfunction. Things that are not independent of each other. There might be coupling between the state charts, but where to assess the quality of life of a given collective state, a state of person is with respect to state chart A, the weight state chart B, the diabetes state chart C, the respiratory health state chart. To assess that quality of life, it's not a single number per state chart, it's a single number overall that of quality of life estimate you want to offer. There's more finesse for how to take into account all those states, but it's readily done. And the question is, as often the case in any logic, and almost invariably the case, it's almost invariably the case in any logic and with ABMs more generally, the question is how to undertake it in the most transparent and declarative, and easily extended and easily evolved and easily refined fashion and so on. Okay, but the pictures is not yet complete. This is the picture at an individual level. And what I want to highlight is that these costs being borne accrue at an aggregate level. So the accumulated costs are being borne at an aggregate across the population right now. The quality of life of that individual is considered when accumulating quality adjusted life years across the population. And indeed, the very fact that an individual is alive accrues life years lived, accumulated life years lived at the population level. So let's go see where those are accrued. Let's go see where those are born and accumulate. Because right now it may seem, very understandably, seem mysterious. Like we have a 2,000 cost per year, but like, how does that become an accumulating cost? And how does quality of life declared here for the state end up turning into quality adjusted life years imposed at an aggregate level? So let's go see this. Let's go down Maine. So we're going to click on Maine. And what we're going to look at is some of these quantities that we may have gestured at, but otherwise ignored when we first looked at the population here and some of the parameters. So you'll notice that there's, so this language may not be familiar with folks, the language of stocks and flows. But I did mention it in an earlier day of the boot camp, and tomorrow will be the center of considerable attention. It's a language of tremendous power and flexibility, particularly for characterizing accumulations and feedback-based systems which exhibit evolution based on their current state, so they're dynamical systems. And where we're interested in characterizing continuous quantities. And that applies very nicely to our case. So here we have 4 quantities that are stored. And I'll orient you that these rectangles here are accumulation. Okay? There are things called stocks. And collectively, those 4 represent kind of the state of this system. So you may recall me saying earlier today, like if you had one number for each of those things in a SI, temporarily immune state, it would fully specify the system. This is where the states are. So it's a certain, at any one time, we will have a certain value for the cumulative life years lived from the population until now. We will have a certain value for the amount of accumulated undiscounted costs accrued from the start of the model till now. We will have a value for the quality adjusted life years lived, where it's no longer just person years considered purely on their own, but considered together, weighted by the quality of life involved. So if a person is deemed in the idea of utility-based measures, if they're deemed at having a quality of life of 0.5, and that person lives for 1 year, we treat them as accruing 1 life year for all they're alive for a year, but we treat them as accruing 0.5 quality adjusted life years because their quality of life is 0.5. So life years lived is going to be a quantity characterized with dimensions person years, person times years. If it's one person living for 100 years, that's 100 person years. If it's two people living for 50 years, that will also be sum up or integrate up to 100 person years, right? If it's 100 people living for 1 year, it'll be 100 person years. But quality adjusted life years, if there's one person with a quality of life of 1 living for a year and another with a quality of life of 0.5 living for a year, then across the two of them, it wouldn't be 2 full life years lived. Seriously, two full quality adjusted life years lived. It would be 1.5, right? 1 for the one who is the full quality of life and 1 for the one with the 0.5 quality of life. So 1.5 quality adjusted life years, not 2, as would be the case for life years. So life years is not taking into account quality of life. Quality adjusted life years is. And by, and over here on the right-hand side, we also have a measure of weighting. So we have undiscounted costs that are accumulated, and then we have discounted costs that take into account opportunity cost of money in the future, the fact that $50,000 10 years from now could have been generated by considerably less than $50,000 now, properly invested. If we didn't have a complete economic disaster being reaped by the U.S. Administration right now. I'll put that aside. So the idea is that, there's an opportunity cost of money, and that if you invest it in a safe resource that's considered risk-free, you could accrue money, and therefore we'll count $10,000 being spent 10 years from now as the equivalent of less than $10,000 now. And so we discount the further we go out. Okay, now, those are the stocks here. But, those are the nouns. The verbs are often the interesting things. And this is true in general with, agent baseball, right? With state charts. Look, the states that you're in are interesting, but the behaviors, the changes over time, the types of influences, the causal pathways, the generative pathways, those are associated with, those are reflected in, captured in, expressed in the transitions, right? Those are the verbs. That's where the real insights often come. That's where, we turn things on and off, and so we see the evolution of the system different. That's how influences affect a person to infect them or cure them or whatever. So the point is that while stocks are important, they describe the state of the system. It's often the flows here. Those are the verbs. Those are the action points. Various flows into and out of the stock. And importantly, as in a state chart where you have multiple transitions in that can be crossed by a certain individual over time, here we have multiple flows in that can occur to a given stock. And we're going to draw our attention to that in just a moment. But let's start with the simple case of a stock like life years lived. So here we're going to have an accumulation of life years. And you may remember if I said, look, flows, these flows are where the actions are, the verb. This is what is changing over time. And the life years stock will accumulate this, okay? So again, if it was one person over 100 years, there will be accrued, built up, accumulated in the stock 100 life years. You can think of it as a bathtub filling up with water. Water is coming in at a rate of 1 liquid measure per unit time. You can choose whether it's liters or gallons, depending on your national preference. And if it's 1 liter per minute, and we run it for 10 minutes, 10 liters will accumulate in that bathtub. There's no outflow. There's no flows out here. So think of it as plugged up for the outflow. There's no outflow out. And this is what happens with this inflow. It's just accumulating this up over time. At a technical level, it's integrating, or numerically integrating. Okay, so you'll notice what the formula. So each of these flows, each of the stocks is driven by it's given an initial value, and after that, its value evolves according to the flows. And you've heard me said from this very seat, sometime in the last few days, like if the inflows are greater than the outflows, the value of the stock will rise. If the outflows are greater than the inflows, the value of the stock will fall. If the two are equal, inflow equals outflow, it's like water coming into the bathtub as quickly as it's going out, and it'll stay constant. So here, there's no flow out, right? So it'll just accrue. It'll just accumulate this, And again, if it's 1 person over 100 years, it will accumulate after 100 years, 100 person years, right? So the flow here has a formula associated with it. It's the action. It's where action's taking place. And in general, that formula will depend on model state. Like the flow in of new infections would depend on the number of susceptibles and the number of current infectives. Here, the flow depends on population size. So the size of the population. Think about it. If the population size was just 1 person, then each successive year the model runs, it will accumulate another year worth of life years, right? The person's living the first year, they've lived 1 life year. Living the second year, they've lived 2 life years. Living their third year, they've lived, after that, they've lived 3 life years. It just accumulates like that. If there were 2 people in the population, then it'd be accumulating the first year, they accumulate 2, and then accumulate 4, and then accumulate 8. That's why the flow in is given by the total population. I mean, that's how quickly the stock is rising. Now, quality adjusted life years is very similar, but here, the value of this flow is not the number of people in the population, it's the total of people in the population weighted by their quality of life. So it's totaling up for each person in the population, person 0, person 1, person 2, person 3, their quality of life. If you want, it may be helpful to think of it as their quality of life times 1 for each of them. It would be 1 for life years, right? We wouldn't worry about their quality of life. It would be 1 plus 1 plus 1 here. Here it's quality of life times 1 plus quality of life times 1 plus quality of life times 1. Where is this calculated? Well, it's calculated in a place we're very familiar with things being calculated. It's statistics. So if we go to cumulative quality of life, here, it's in population because it's a statistic. We would go see cumulative quality of life, just the sum over the population, mind you. Saying cumulative is a bit potentially, it's inviting confusion here. I would change it these days. This is quality of life cumulative across the population. Population cumulative quality of life. It's a sum of the quality of life for each person. Or you could think of it, you might want to think of this as this times 1.0. Okay. So we're moving right along. But now we get to this more textured, more involved measure, which is accumulated undiscounted cost, or actually, it's not so much a more complicated measure, it's a more complicated process that accumulates it. So here, we're going to have two sources of cost accumulating, just totaling up these costs over time. There's 100 costs coming in via the total flows in year one, and $100 per year two across those flows. 100 each of the flows is some number of dollars per year. So if it's 100 per year coming in the first year for that year, 100 in the next year would be 200 accrued across those years. So it's just totaling it up. It's just integrating, summing it up. Okay. Now, there's two components of this. That's why there are two flows. One component is from health services cost. The other, importantly, is from costs associated with interventions undertaken for the population. So the idea here is that, if we have a prediabetes prevention intervention, we might have costs accrued for that, right? Like screening costs per year for a person, and maybe costs to engage in motivational interviewing or cognitive behavioral therapy, or to help match them up with a walking group and help encourage them if they're, falling out of contact, encourage them, engage in a bit of friendly encouragement, reminders. So maybe it's $5,000 for that intervention per year to maintain them in this system, in a walking group, which is one of those interventions found years back by the CDC to be evidence-based, to show evidence-based statistically significant impacts on health. So the idea here is that there is accumulation of costs in general, but it comes through two pathways. One is through health services, and one is through interventions. And we're going to examine the impacts of interventions. And you may wonder, you could be excused for wondering, well, wait a minute, if interventions are costing money, why are we undertaking? Because they save lives, one. But they also, we think about a person level, may lead someone to go back to a normal glycemic state, or at least stay around this pre-diabetic state in a way that will prevent them from going on to the diabetes state, right? And having done this, this is pre-diabetic prevention hazard. Having done that, keeping them here or having them go back, which is the main operative thing, we're preventing them from accruing this costs that are very material for these states down here. Modest, but still significant for type 2 diabetes, huge for end-stage renal disease, huge for each transplant given. So if we can keep them up in these states, we can save a lot of money potentially, but down the road, and that would normally be taken into account of in the discounting factor. So here we have these two types of costs being borne. One for our intervention, 0 in the baseline, and one for our just health services delivery, giving services to make sure these people are appropriately cared for. Unfortunately, all too often in a disease care system rather than a health care system, as Jeff McDonald was Riley noted. Okay, so how much cost accumulates per year? We saw it earlier with life years, right? There are two people on a per year basis, their life years will rise by 2 accumulated life years per year. What's going on here? Well, what's going on is that we accrue cost per year from those people. And how much is that cost per year? Well, once again, it's calculated within this population cost per year. And what do we do? Well, we total up across the agents in the population. Not one for each agent, which would just be their population size. We don't total up their quality of life. We total up their cost per year. Well, where's that characterized? Well, we saw where it's characterized. It's their cost per year. Remember, this was assigned to 100 for this state, or 2,000 for this state, or $50,000 a year for this state. So each person has a value of this variable, and what that population does, the statistic and population does, is just total that up across the population. It sums it up. Thus far, most of our attention has been focused on counting the number of pre-diabetics, for example. We're very familiar with that. Or taking the average over some indicator function, like an indicator function about whether someone's effective or not. But here, we're taking the sum over their cost per year. Okay, so we're totaling up on a continuous basis, continually. Like, people are changing in this underlying person state, but you could think of these flows as accruing continuously. Not every year or something, not just once a year. No. Just going on a very, very fine-grained basis. It may be once per day or something. So fine that it's very, very, very small compared to the time frames in which they change their state. So these are accumulating. And to complete the picture with this, we have these costs from the interventions. And you notice that these intervention costs can tell. Well, anyway, I won't say anything. These intervention costs are of two sorts. They're both cost per year. That's why they're associated with the flow. Flows, if you have a stock of units X, maybe it's persons, the flows in and out of it will be dimensions X or units X per ton. So this flow. This here flow is of units person per year. Okay. So intervention screening costs per year and lifestyle change intervention costs. Where do those come from in turn? Well, they come from two places. They come here. There's some from the scenario. This is why it's a parameter. I mean, the scenario specifies the cost per diabetic per person for a pre-diabetic lifestyle intervention cost per year, imposed by a pre-diabetic as part of this lifestyle intervention. That is going to contribute to this cost across the whole population by taking that and multiplying by the number of pre-diabetics. You may wonder where that was going to figure that population statistic. So we have, $5,000 per pre-diabetic. And if there were 2 pre-diabetics, it would give us $10,000 born per year. And therefore, it just accumulates in. That's the flow rate in from this, $10,000 a year. For 6 months a year, half of that will accrue, 5,000. In the next 6 months, another. So this is a rate per year rate that it's calculating by multiplying the number of pre-diabetics by the cost per year of each pre-diabetic. And then it's a similar thing, mutatis mutandis, with their screening costs. We have cost per year associated with that screening. Maybe this is they have to screen all non-diabetics. The idea being that we will know who to treat these as diagnosed diabetics. I'm kind of glossing over that distinction here. So we have a count of non-diabetics that we need to screen, and then we have cost per year for each of them of screening. And that yields another total of cost per year that flow into here, that are associated with this flow. So this simply adds those up and it flows into here. So we have this mixing of health services cost and costs borne by the intervention. And this other flow is kind of similar, except that each of these is multiplied by a discount factor, which grows smaller and smaller over time at a rate given by this discount rate. So discount rate is 3%, as was recommended by Blue Ribbon Panel, I think, in the US, late 90s or something. Then the discount factor would be going down from 1 at the start of the model, successfully down this exponential way that reflects the discounting. That just multiplies whatever value of this flow times that will give the value of discounted. And the same thing with this, just this value times the discount factor. So it accumulates discounted costs. Okay, so there you have it. From the person level, the person's having quality of life and costs for given states, right? I hope that you're getting a sense, as mediated by the statistics here, how we can total those up across the population, and then how those can factor into these accumulations here associated with the flows. But you may have noticed that I have avoided talking about one type of cost thus far. And it's now that I'll talk about that. It's a very simple idea. So you remember that there were a large number of costs borne per year. And those are the things that flow into these states. I'm just totaling up per year state. These are flows that are like dollars per year or life years, person years per year, which is persons, which is why this is person, persons, or QALYs per year, etc. Dollars per year for this guy here. But what about those costs that are borne by like an event or imposed by an event? An event, say, like an occurrence of a transplant for a particular person. Well, it's actually rather simple, and it's a testimonial that any logic, provides us the affordance to employ this technique. But basically, when that happens, this might make some old school system nemesis blush, but we just add that $75,000 into the accumulated discounted costs and the accumulated actually that times the discount factor, the accumulated discounted costs, we add it in directly to the accumulated undiscounted costs. So we just add 75,000 to the stock. Boom, bada boom, bada boom. Just done. Add it to the stock. It's not a flow. It's a cost borne by a particular circumstance. And yeah, you could try to render it into a flow, but the idea here is to have a fairly rich, in general, to have a fairly rich depiction of a person's circumstances. There may be some costs borne unexpectedly and some costs borne, by their particular circumstance. So according to heterogeneity, and trying to turn that all into flows, you engage in stratification by different aspects of the person and their stage of infection. And that's a type of self-harm I will not engage in, like to try to break all that down through stratification and to force fit our model Procrustes like onto the bed of easy stratification in my mind is like cutting off Procrustes' legs to have him fit on the bed. But that's a philosophical statement, which not everyone would agree. In general, not all modelers certainly, but I feel it's an abuse of choosing the right tool for the job, no more so than I would use a hammer to pound in a screw. You want the good tool for the job, and you want a tool here which can capture the requisite heterogeneity among people and potentially their interactions with health services and the delay times possibly associated with transplant or whatever, and lets you focus on the types of system phenomena that you want to have in the scope of your model, rather than force fitting it into a certain framework because the language doesn't express it easily in a monoculture of a model framework where you're using one type of model, one type of language of modeling. So here I feel that often, particularly when there's when there are network effects, when there are facts involving networks, they're in network transmission, when there's spatial factors, when there's large amounts of heterogeneity, when history dependence is critical, as it is in many spheres of health, when you want to characterize individual level interventions focused on certain risk factors that vary from person to person in a heterogeneous way. This is a natural mode of description, and we can go and add in elements into that. Take system dynamics, beautiful framework, just amazingly well suited in general, but we can have it be fitted to our situation when we need it. So there we go. That's accumulating those episodic costs, those costs that are born in certain events or certain circumstances, and not on a per year basis, but on a per occurrence or event basis. So this is the broad arc of this model. I hope that's given you, some sense. I haven't run this model in years, but let's go. We can go see how it accrues. So we have some population of size 1,000. We have individuals in that population of different states. So this person is normal glycemic. Well, yeah, we could have divided people up among different states. Maybe most people would be currently normal glycemic. But if we speed it up and we end up, going a number of years in, okay, so it's.
I think you need to change the time capture on the plots. I think it's also in minutes and it's clogging the model.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah. So here we go. So that's an excellent point. I was thinking about doing it earlier, but it slipped my mind. Yeah. Yeah, here we go. Okay, years. Boom. Yeah. Years. And let's zoom out. Thank you, Matthews, again. We want to do the two lower ones, and then we've got to do this one on the upper right. 1 year. Watch out for that. I will say that that often comes when you start a model in a different time unit. You don't correct it individually, and then you try to switch it after the fact. I'm not sure what happened with this model. It shows signs of not being all created by my hand. Okay, so here we go. Here we have an accruing of states. You'll notice the model is running rip snorting fast compared to previously. And I will just highlight, come on. Yep. We have these individuals in these different states. Still looks like most people are normal glycemic, but let's go run it here at a faster pace of fitting. Yeah. Okay. And my guess is, yeah, many people have died by now. But those remaining, this is a normal glycemic person, yeah, etc. Okay. I will just highlight that we're accumulating here the life years lived across the population, the quality adjusted life years. The costs, you notice there's a slight discontinuity. Well, it's not a discontinuity, but it rises a bit faster, and that may be due to some transplants taking place, etc. And here is the life years lived predominantly because of the population aging. So this is a little model of health economics in its very simple form. I'll post it with those corrected units. I will just, I'm going to, forgive me, but it's a skill that needs to be taught. And I just want to develop confidence in this, that this is going as expected. So I'm going to go to this state, and I'm going to put these, I'm going to put in these trace LNs. These allow you to print things out to what's called the console. And this is probably my most, my foremost tool for working through the, debugging these models, checking what's going on. So what do? I'll put it in the chat, but I think you can find it in your own. This trace LN will print out a message to the chat window, and it can report information like these here. So I just want to make sure, as a sanity check, that that's a term of art in computer science, that we in fact have, people reaching a yep, here are folks receiving transplants. We can actually report who it is that received their transplant, and potentially we could record information about their history and report things there if we wish to do so. Yep. So this is operating properly. Just because I want to get to the case study and respect people's Friday afternoons, I do want to highlight up here another model. And this model, I pointed out before, it's called Interaction of Weight and Diabetes, Melbourne Health Economics, right? And this model hews to a general similar framework, but modified. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. I forgot one thing with this original model. I'm terribly sorry. Here in this original model, we have a baseline, and then we have like alternative scenarios. And then we have what's called a parameter variation experiment. And I stand remiss, or rather I sit blameful for not having talked about this, because this actually is the key finishing thought for this model. So this is not an experiment of the simple sort you've seen. This is what's called a parameter variation experiment. So its job in life is not to run the model with one parameter. Sorry, not to run the model once, but multiple times. In this case, it runs it twice. We use these parameter variation experiments in other cases, like with stochastic Monte Carlo experiments. We run the model maybe in an ensemble of 100 runs or 1,000 realizations, as we call it, where we run it again and again and again with the same assumptions, so we can give a sense of the regularities that cover these, and we can accumulate those and information on those and look at the distributions of results and statistically compare with non-parametric tests that one model is, the one intervention is securing higher QALYs and lower costs than another, or what have you. Here, the job in life of this scenario, in this same model, basic health economics, its job in life is to run the model twice. Once for the baseline and once for an intervention. So the pre-diabetic prevention hazard is 0 for the first run, to wit, the baseline, and 0.25 for the next one. So in case you're wondering, that 0.25 is the same value as here. So for the intervention case, that's the value we want to use. Similarly, for a parameter per non-diabetic capital intervention screening costs, per non-diabetic capita intervention screening costs per year is 0 for the baseline, 200, because that's for the intervention case, it's where we're performing the screening. In the baseline, we're not performing the screening. It's the idea. This intervention screening described here. It's $200 for the aggressive pre-diabetic prevention intervention, 0 otherwise. And again, that reflects the $200 here. And similarly with the $5,000 per year for maintaining them in their walking groups and motivational support, etc. Maybe sending them reminder messages or what have you. Okay, so the idea here is that we run the model twice, once for the baseline, once for the intervention. And then, and this is really important, there's a bit of bringing that together and calculating incremental cost effectiveness ratio. So you'll notice that we, for each run, each realization, we memorize, we remember, we store away the life years lived, the quality adjusted life years lived, the accumulated undiscounted costs, and the accumulated discounted costs. In case you're wondering, those are these quantities right up here that we perused earlier and that I explained in terms of the flows. Give me a center it, these quantities, right? for each run of the model, we store away that value at the end of the model, for this incremental cost effectiveness calculation. So first we have to run the model for the baseline, the intervention. We squirrel away for each what the result was for each of these quantities. So this life years for scenario, and QALYs for scenarios, those are things here. They're so-called collections in any logic that can store multiple values, like remember multiple values for different indices. Great. So each time we run it for each of these, store those away, get them stored away for the baseline, get them stored away for the intervention. And then after that iteration, if we're done, we're going to, so if we've run it 2 times, or we've run it completely, yes, 2 times, we will do what's called perform incremental cost effectiveness calculations. And this is our friend of function. In the incremental cost effectiveness calculation, not surprisingly, the incremental QALYs, so the QALYs for the intervention minus the QALYs for the baseline. The incremental cost, the incremental discounted cost, the extra cost borne by the intervention compared to the baseline is given by a similar value for the intervention minus value for the baseline. Same thing with life years, same thing with undiscounted costs, mutatis mutandis. And then we calculate the incremental cost per incremental discounted cost per incremental QALY, incremental undiscounted cost per incremental QALY, incremental discounted cost per incremental life year, incremental discounted cost per incremental life year as the division among us. So if we were to run this here, and we were to get this going, okay, we got a bunch of people reporting transplants from those various ones because I didn't so-called comment that out. But you'll notice that now we have the incremental discounted cost per QALY. I don't know if anyone is a student of cost effectiveness, but this is outstanding discounted cost per QALY. This is an outstanding undiscounted cost per QALY. That's like bang for the buck. If you can save a QALY adjusted life year for less than $1,000, you are doing real good. You haven't saved money, but it's going to cost comparatively low to save that QALY adjusted life year, and save that life year. It's also so per life year saved. Gosh, you can save a year someone's life, keep them alive for another year by adding years to their life. But a year to their life with $800. Charges of my credit card. I mean, that's a great. I mean, if it's less than, I think back when I was doing these things more commonly, it was something like, you might pay over $100,000 per life year saved or something, and this is, less than 1,000. So that's pretty good. So that's how this works. We're reporting these things here at the end of the run. Now, I'll just note briefly, because again, I want to feature Wade's presentation here. I want to highlight this one, weight and diabetes interaction. And this one is more finesse. And students should be able to answer questions about either of these if you're interested. To go into these more, we can talk about them tomorrow in more detail, really, dissect them at a more detailed level yet, although I've tried to offer a pretty close walkthrough. But let's look at this. Here we have two state charts, right? And for those interested, we actually have a hazard rate that changes by age, for example, of developing overweight. And we have we have some chance of developing obesity and so on. And the same thing with whether they're normal, glycemic, and diabetic, and there's a mortality process. There's this little self transition is basically keeping those hazard rates updated to reflect their current age. Excuse me. This one is actually not done by age, so I'm it's probably because the coefficient is changing. Anyway, the point is, you can also ask for like their quality of life and total annualized costs in a way that takes into account both their state in this and their state in that. Okay. And there's this thing called quality of life for a diabetic by weight and quality of life for diabetic by weight is, and I'd have to go, oh, here it is. Quality of life, my diabetic by weight. So what this is saying is by successive weight classes for someone with diabetes, these are the quality of life we'll consider. For a normal glycemic person, someone in this state, these are the quality of life we'll consider by different weight statuses. So you'll notice they're different because the quality of life people have for different levels of weight is considered different among diabetics than normal glycemic individuals. And similarly, the costs that are borne for different weight status, successive normal and underweight, overweight, obese, is different if they are diabetic. The costs borne by this are different. The cost borne for people of different weights is different if the person who has them also has diabetes compared to if they don't. If they're normal glycemic, if they're in this state, there are different costs borne by each weight state. Now, these are costs on a per year basis. That's why it says annualized costs for diabetic by weight or annualized costs for normal diabetic by weight. You'll notice there is a mortality hazard for age. That's why we were calculating this. So you can kind of look it up. This is how we characterize mortality as varying by age. And you'll recognize this current age thing where we take the current time minus the birth time. That's that same idiom we used. But here we can look up by age what someone's mortality is or what their chance of developing overweight is by age and apply that to their chance of leaving here. That to reflect that our rate of leaving, our hazard rate of transitioning down here will be different. Conditional on being normal glycemic, it will be different by weight. And my chance of developing overweight will be, by age, excuse me. It'll be different according to my age. That's why I look up my current age in this so-called table function. Here I go. I say, oh, I'm a 40-year-old. What's my chance of dying per year for if I'm normal glycemic? Or I'm a 70-year-old. What's my chance of dying per year? It's about 0.05 for a 70-year-old. Yeah. There we go. So if you're interested in like how to make people's chance of transitioning differ, their hazard rate of going down a certain transition based on other aspects of your state, this could be an instructive model. But you'll notice that the overall picture is very similar. There you go, your 4 friends. There you go, your discount rate. What's different here is right now we're not having costs come in because of event or episodic costs, like they get a transplant or what have you, where they're all state-based costs. They're all costs accrued by virtue of being in a state. That's what's accumulating right now. And we use the same trick. We total up across the population here, the annualized costs or the quality of life, total it up, and we can, have these things just flow in. It looks like here we're not accumulating, interestingly, I guess it was by stakeholder request, we're not accumulating life years. We're just accumulating discounted QALYs and QALYs, which is interesting. But we also have some plots coming out on regarding the results. Oh, and then we have a intervention coefficients of various sorts, which we can apply for some of these interventions, but we're not to simulate interventions, but we're not. It looks like, anyway. So that's the idea here with this model. And again, I'm glad to discuss it tomorrow, or some of the TAs can help parcel this out. But the real innovation, such as it was, this is another model I had to do live. The real innovation here, vis-a-vis the one we were looking at earlier, the really basic one, is taking into account jointly these two states when considering costs accrued per year or QALYs enjoyed by a person per year. Okay, those are all my comments on these models. Oh, this is an open population model, which, well, so was the other, but there's bursts in this one. Okay, so those are all my comments on those health economics models, both available to you, and glad to talk about. Oh, it also has a scenario just like the other where it performs the incremental cost effectiveness analysis. So glanced at that for a moment. I didn't emphasize it. Any questions about that before we go on to a case study presented by our lead TA, Wade McDonald? Yes, Matthews.
So if I was thinking, how would you account for costs that are not that clear, like kind of hidden costs, such as productivity loss or like early death costs, etc.?
Yeah.
And
So
how would you discuss that with stakeholders too?
right. So early death cost is considered here. Like, if people in the intervention live longer than those in the model, like there are costs accrued for a person in those extra years. But I suspect you're talking about a different perspective here, where there's a loss in another sense to society for that person having died. You're not thinking so much of the costs accrued to the healthcare system, so much as cost accrued to society, probably, for this, or certain out-of-pocket costs. And if I'm understanding correctly, costs of lost productivity to society as a result of this. I think this general framework, its general features could be applied could be applied to that. Like you could examine the accrued benefit to society of people living now and total that up over their lifespan, and and across the population. And then for the intervention, if you were successful in reducing deaths and successful in reducing deaths, or in raising quality of life in a way that allowed someone to work that otherwise wouldn't, that will be reflected in higher numbers in that case for these accrued kind of benefits, as it were. And those would be larger than in the baseline, which would have fewer accrued benefits there. And presumably in your cost calculations, you would want to take into account then the not just the cost borne to the healthcare system or the cost borne out of pocket by an individual's, but you'd want to take into account, the benefits that they offered societally over their lifetime. And so you'd view that as kind of debiting the costs, like reducing their costs. So yeah, maybe they bore a lot of costs in their lifetime to the health system, but maybe they accrued benefit to society of a certain amount that you could total up. And again, that's going to be larger in general for a successful intervention than for the baseline. And as a result, we would be able to characterize, those that in our cost calculation, and we might find that essentially, given the longer lives, the greater productivity, extending someone's life, the benefits there that are accrued by an intervention, that cancels out the extra costs, accrued to the health system. If they're not commensurate, like if you can't subtract one from the other, if there are different units, there are different dimensions, and you can't do it, you could have a different calculation that says, like these are the costs borne to the healthcare system per quality adjusted life year saved. These are the benefits accrued by the intervention relative to the baseline, across that time period. And you could, if you wanted, you could express those per life year saved. I mean, maybe you save no life years, but you accrue more benefits because people can be kept working longer, despite a disability or something, and it doesn't accrue their extra years. But maybe there are times, yeah. So I'm not sure if you'd want to do it in a ratio form like that. I mean, I'm not convinced that the ratio form is what you want, because it's a benefit on both, and it's a benefit, and that you're capturing. It's not like per life year we gain a certain or we cost a certain amount. Instead, it's like an extra benefit accrued. So maybe it's a little bit more similar to sort of cost benefit type of thing. But if they can't be computed separate, if they can't be computed in a way that's commensurate, so one could be subtracted from another, you can compute them separately. And then if that was the case, then I would look at it like Pareto frontier, an optimal frontier in a multi-criteria decision-making context where we have, multiple types of considerations that are not directly commensurate. And you ask if one strategy dominates another. It both saves, it saves costs to the health system. It saves in terms of life years lived, and it increases productivity. But then there might be some things which, in terms of the efficient frontier, dominate other strategies like them. But there's that where you have to give up benefits to society to reduce costs to the healthcare system or something like that. It's possible you could have that but it's possible as well that the nature of things would allow for dominant strategies very readily. So that's an interesting one, and I would either approach it through multi-criteria decision making, optimal frontier, Pareto analysis, or I'd approach it through a generalization where you could subtract the two for cost minus benefit or something like that. That's off the top of my head. I'm naive about that area, but those would be the things that strike me as sort of obvious impulses on my part. I don't know if that's helpful. I talked to someone who knows how these things are treated. Are they commensurate or not? Can one be subtracted from another? Do they have to be approached in a multi-criteria decision-making context where they're not commensurate? Hopefully those comments are of some help.
Yeah,
Right?
they're really helpful.
Right?
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions anyone would like to ask? Here. Going once? Going twice? Okay. If not, I think we'll